Boardroom Bound, episode 156, Exploring Strategies for Effective Board Leadership, with Raza, Shaikh and Ayoub.
How can you be the best board member you can be? How can we help this team drive the strategic plan? How can we make them successful? How can we help them create the kind of succession plan that they need? Those are the things that boards need to be able to do, but it's a working relationship. And the better that relationship is, usually the more effective a board can be.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we have a special episode. We have two guests joining. We have Raza, Shaikh and Ayoub, and they lead, if you are not familiar with, the On Boards podcast. They're the co-hosts, and I'm going to recommend if you enjoy binging on this show, you might enjoy binging on theirs as well. We're going to talk about their show and what they've learned from their fabulous guests, and their show covers quite a different range, not just what we do on this show, but also things like what makes a board successful or unsuccessful, or what it takes to be an effective board member, what challenges boards are facing, and how they're assessing those challenges. We're going to hear a lot of those topics, plus their own individual expertise and experience. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Welcome to my two guests today, Raza, Shaikh and Ayoub. Welcome to the show, guys. Delighted to have you here. And this is going to be a lot more fun than usual since I have two expert voices to call upon. And you guys have your own podcast that I know our audience is going to want to be listening to. But before we start digging into some of those nuggets, you guys both bring a unique and different background to the show today. So, Raza, why don't we start with you? Tell us a bit about your background and experience and how that positioned you for the show. And then we'll share that with Joe, and then we'll start getting into your podcast.
Absolutely, Alexander. Thank you very much for having us. We're delighted to be here. My quick background is immigrant, technology founder, software entrepreneur, turned into investors. I've been angel investing for a little bit, and then as I got involved with investing in companies, I also got exposed with being a board member on investments that we make, and through this journey, I came about and ended up in the world of boards.
And Joe, how about yourself?
Well, I was a trial lawyer for many years. I represented a number of private businesses, particularly family businesses, and virtually every kind of litigation that families can have, and through that became very close to a number of client businesses and spent a lot of time with them and their boards, if they had a board. I also was fortunate enough to join my first board at the age of 29. It came about in a very unusual way. Someone called to recruit my father to a board, and he said he didn't have time, but he thought I did. So that is how I joined the first board. It was a nonprofit board, Big Brothers, Big Sisters of Massachusetts. It was a phenomenal experience. And between the legal side, seeing boards and what they could do for their companies, or what happened when there weren't boards, and being a part of a really, really amazing board with big brothers, big sisters, it really, really created a lot of interest on my part to be a part of the governance of companies and organizations.
And I think this is a wonderful setup for today's episode because I know from hearing from most of my listeners, when they think of a board, they generally think of like a public company board. And there are many of those seats, but they're dwarfed in number. When you think about other options, certainly private companies, from startup companies, from venture-backed companies, nonprofit is a whole other world on the side as well. There's just so many different types of opportunities, ESOP, and it goes on and on and on. So it's wonderful that we're going to be able to call upon more of your backgrounds today and your experiences. I don't think we do enough justice on the show around that. So how did you guys get together and start your podcast and tell us about it?
Alexander, when I met Joe Ayoub, we started talking about it at some point in the board circles, whether it will be at NACD or Private Directors Association, and we would hang out together. And there came a point at a coffee meeting where I suggested to Joe, saying this topic of boards has been kind of opaque. People think about those, they hear about those, and think that there's something that they don't understand what goes behind closed doors. And wouldn't it be good to bring that into light in the form of a podcast? This is the time around when podcasts were yet not as popular, and this is before the time of the pandemic. And we thought this would be a good 30-minute listen driving to a meeting or in between meetings. And we thought we would bring guests. Joe, how did it come about for you?
Yeah, very similar. I would say part of our conversation, and as it turns out, part of what has made it so exciting is that Raza and I have an opportunity to speak with some of the best people, some of the best, most interesting people who have been involved in boards in some way, either as board members, as investors, as C-suite, as consultants, the whole range of possible involvement. And what quickly happened was those conversations that we were having really became so interesting that we, at least I think we both just realized that the podcast was not only very informative, but it was really a lot of fun, and a lot more fun than maybe the very, very brief conversations that you have an opportunity to have at, a networking event where you talk to someone for 5 minutes and you really don't get to the meat of what you want to talk about. It just doesn't happen. Whereas on the podcast, we're able to do that, and it's been a lot of fun. It's really informative.
And I know you're
on. We named our podcast On Boards Podcast, and it is all about board governance topics and how companies can best utilize their board.
Yeah, and I that's true, and it's also true that as the podcast has gone on, we've spent more time focused on issues that boards and senior management are facing, and the things they need to do in order to address those issues, whether it be risk management or ESG or diversity, inclusion, all of the things that boards are confronting and need to know about and need to know about in order to help the organization that they serve. And that has also really made it quite interesting. People on boards and people involved in companies really seem to want to talk about this because the reality is the more knowledgeable that the group of people who are on boards or who want to be on boards are about what their responsibilities are and what companies need, the better it is. And the better it is for the companies or the organization.
Well, I enjoy that your aspect probably covers the boardroom from a few different angles. Like when I think about some of your episodes, I hear things like what makes a board successful or not, and what it takes to be an effective board member, what challenges boards are facing, how they're assessing those challenges, and how to make your board one of the most valuable assets of your organization. And many times in this show, we're talking more about perhaps how you land your first board seat or become successful once you're there, perhaps turn it into a professional portfolio if that's what you want to do. So you're also talking about people who are leading the organizations, whether they're the owners, the family members, the customers, the people who've been on board, and you're tackling it from different perspectives. And I'm sure that's given you just a wealth of knowledge and stories. We talked about the fun, and I share that with you that you have as the co-host of something like this. So I wonder whether each of you has sort of a favorite story from one of your episodes that you sort of has always stuck in the back of your mind of like, that was just so much fun to hear this from so-and-so and their own experience.
Alexander, I'll start. I think the most recent episode that we had with Rob Leckenauer and Josh Barron was very interesting for me. I learned that why shows like Succession and other shows that glorify family businesses in a different light, the light of drama, are not really a true reflection of what actually goes on with family businesses. And family businesses are some of the more and most enduring businesses in our country. They had a very good framework for how family businesses can think about endurance and building a lasting business. They've written a wonderful book called HBR Family Business Handbook that gives a wonderful. I thought that episode was a recent highlight for me. Joe can talk about another and maybe more.
Yeah, no, first of all, Alexander, you said something earlier that really did resonate, which is that we're able to look at boards from a lot of different perspectives, and there are so many different types of boards. It isn't just public, private, nonprofit. Within the private business world, there are many flavors and varieties. And as Raza said, and I agree with him, our most recent episode about family business was particularly really highlighted that. The general concept, and he mentioned Succession, and it's been years and years of TV shows and Wall Street Journal articles, and what people generally seem to think is that family businesses don't last long, they're full of drama, there's a lot of conflict, and that's what they're like. And it's just not true. And that's what was particularly interesting about this last episode. We talked a lot about the fact that, in fact, family businesses last longer than non-family businesses, for the most part, that they are really the backbone of the American economy, and that, as one of our guests said, the fact is there's a lot of conflict avoidance, and part of the problem or part of the issue that consultants and certainly board members have to deal with is the fact that families often won't talk to each other and won't be candid with each other. So the kind of stuff that you see on something like Succession or in the old days on Dallas or Dynasty or any of those shows, it's just a contrivance of Hollywood. It exists, but it's a tiny, tiny percent of what really happens in the family business world. So that was very interesting. I think our first episode of this season was with a woman named Maria Motes, and she is with PwC, was for years their diversity and inclusion director, and we had a great conversation with her about the fact that diversity and inclusion, in its broadest view, really is fundamental to effective boards. You really have a far more effective board if you are inclusive, if you have a diversity of perspective, if you have a diversity of background. And I know that the recent PwC survey, which I think just was published within the last few weeks, really confirmed that. So the evidence seems to be that some of the things that people have been talking about for years in boards, having that kind of diversity, not just gender, not just racial, not just ethnic, but diversity of backgrounds in so many ways, is really starting to gain more momentum because people are realizing that that is what will make their board effective. And of course, board effectiveness is very much tied to company success. So it's a financial incentive. And now that it's clearly becoming more clear that there's a financial incentive in having a strong board, people are really listening to this kind of advice. And I think it's great.
And we've seen that, Joe, especially for public companies where it's much more visible. People are more aware, perhaps paying more attention about the diversity in a boardroom. And I'd love to go back just a minute ago because we were almost starting to open up what the world of private company boards looks like. And I think that's a lot less clear to many people listening to this show. And why don't we spend a little bit of time, because you both live in that space, you both work there so well and touch in different places, really describing for our audience a lot of those different types of opportunities and how to pursue them, right? I think most of us, it's pretty easy to think about, okay, I can imagine what this company does. Public companies have so much information out there. You can go and prepare for the interviews by listening to investor calls, etc. It would be a lot more difficult, perhaps, to do diligence on a private company when an opportunity opens up. So I'd love for you both to sort of think about all the experiences you have individually had and what you've heard from the show to sort of share that insights with our audience.
Alexander, for private company boards in the startup world, and these are investor-backed boards, meaning a lot of the board members are nominated by investors. I think in that world, part of getting onto such a private board is a function of two things. Even those startup boards need an independent director, and that independent director comes with expertise, knowledge of either the industry. That's one dimension for that independent director that venture-backed or investor-backed boards look for. The second area would be if they are a team builder or an organization builder skill set person, how to grow companies and how to grow organizations. And that skill is very valuable if they don't have industry expertise, but then still are an independent board member. And the third dimension that usually comes into play for an independent board member for investor-backed companies is the notion of the CEO coach, somebody who can actually help the CEO grow. And maybe roughly in these three buckets is what private companies that can be categorized as startups or investor-backed are looking for. So I think you want to highlight one of those three potential areas that you fit with a company. And similar to doing the public company exercise of learning about it, I think if you want to be a board member for an investor-backed company, you then search based on your expertise which companies are raising money and be able to network to investors and entrepreneurs in those companies, and that's how you find out about them.
Yeah, I think one thing you said earlier, Alexander, is very much on the money, so to speak, which is that there are many more private companies than public companies. And there are many more private company boards and opportunities in private business companies. So investor-backed boards is one, but their family businesses is kind of another. There are many. One thing that you said that I think is not exactly necessarily true is how easy it is to learn about the business. Because at least what I do now, as I think you may know, is I do recruiting. I help private companies build boards or make their current boards, stronger and more high performing. And when we do that, and this is true pretty much across any kind of recruiting for private boards, we do a lot of work to get information about the company out to candidates that we talk to. So the information kind of comes to them in a way. And because of the internet, there's still a lot of information about private companies out there. Not the same as public, obviously, but the fact is there are so many more opportunities in the private business world, and more opportunities for increasingly for independent members. So families who used to think they had a good board or thought they had a good board, but it was all family, now are more and more realizing they really need non-family members. They need independent members. It's, again, back to that whole question of, diversity of perspective. But it's also true that in non-family businesses, more and more companies are realizing that because of the need and the value of diversity of background and experience and et cetera, more people have an opportunity to serve on boards. There was a time, I'm sure you know this, not that long ago, 10, 15 years ago, when boards looked for people who had served as CEOs or other roles in the C-suite. That was kind of what people look for. And that is no longer as true as it was at all. People are looking for very specific skills depending on the company. And that is one thing that gives rise to so much more opportunity. And then, of course, there's the idea that you can gain some board experience by joining a nonprofit board to start. And that is what happened to me, and I was really just fortunate that it did. But it really opened my eyes to what a board was, what the duties of a board member were, and when private companies, public companies, any for-profit companies looking, they typically are looking for someone with some kind of board experience. So it's a classic chicken and egg thing. If you don't have the experience, how do you get it?
Right.
And one way to do that still is by joining a nonprofit board. And my advice to people that when they say, well, what board should I join? Find a mission that really speaks to you. Because if you have a passion for the mission, it's going to really make a big difference in that first board seat.
And I agree with you, Joe. I think there's several paths to get there. A nonprofit is a classic one. You mentioned one you were on, which is one that people recognize the name of, right? And I think there's a big difference if you can work in an organization people know and respect versus a local nonprofit that someone's never heard of and they don't know what sort of, how rigorous it is, what sort of governance is around it, and how much to value that experience. And I imagine you guys get asked the same questions that I do on a regular basis, some which are, how do I land a board seat? And you've described one path there, Joe. It's like, go get some experience. You can do it being a nonprofit. And there are other paths. There are people that are in the C-suite. Maybe they're already presenting to their board of their company. So that's some experience they could talk about. And I would love to hear the answers that you probably give to people. They say, how do I go about landing my first board seat? And maybe some of these are stories that your guests have shared on your show about how they went about it.
The one I'll mention is from an organization called Bolster.com. And Matt Blumberg, who has been a guest on our podcast, he talks about this concept of board readiness. Alexander, as you mentioned, that it's not that it's the chicken and egg problem of how do you get on a board if you don't have experience and so on. And he talks about the things that one can do to be ready for a board. As an example, as you mentioned, that presenting to a board on a regular basis is something that gets you there. Getting trained with different programs helps you get there. One of our favorite guests, David Koenig from the BCRO, runs a wonderful program for qualified risk director program. And that program teaches you how to manage and govern risk at the board level. So it's a combination of things that make you board ready. And I think that concept that Matt Blumberg advocates at Bolster.com was one idea to add to that list.
Yeah, that's a great, your last point there, Raza, I'm really glad you brought it up, the DCRO. David Koenig was a guest of ours, and really one of the most impactful guests we had. He has started this program that people can become certified in risk identification and management. Why is that a good way to get on a board? Because it's a skill that every board needs. So one of the things you can do to get yourself on a board is to think about what the boards need and put yourself in a position to have that skill. In the world we live in, especially the post-pandemic, well, I don't know if post, but the post-COVID world, there is a increased appreciation and understanding for how important the role of a board is in risk identification and working with management to address those risks. So something like becoming a certified risk expert can be very helpful. The other thing, and this isn't any great insight, is networking. Being on a board is a job. It is work. You are taking a job to do something that takes a lot of time and effort, and you have to be very conscientious about it. If you were looking for a job, what would you do? You would use your network as best you could to find those opportunities. That sounds like, obvious information. Maybe it is, but it seems to me that a lot of people don't look at a board seat as a job, quote unquote, and somehow they go about it in a different way. It is like a lot of other jobs. You network, you let everyone know, you have a resume that's a board resume, like you would have for different kind of job applications. And as you do that, and as you have those conversations, you will, over time, I think you will eventually learn where there are opportunities. There's no easy way to do it, but that is, I think, an effective way to do it.
And I would agree with you. Approaching it like a job makes a lot of sense.
One other thing to add, our guest, Didi, or Rocket Diesel, with Egon Zender, I think she mentioned basically put yourself on the radar for organizations that help recruit board members. And I think that's the way to get started as well. Board positions get filled in many ways, many of them through the network, meaning when the conversation comes about, we need a board member. Many times they're looking around the table saying, who do you know that we can add as a board? Other times they want to do a more formal search to find the right board member. And getting yourself on the radar of organizations that help with those board searches is another avenue for getting on boards.
Well, another big part of your show is really about being effective in the boardroom for the board as a whole, as an entity, for an organization to be successful, but also for each individual board member to be effective in their role. And I'd love for us to spend a little bit of time also thinking about the guidance that you guys also have from your own day jobs where you're advising doing this, but the experience you've heard from people that have been on your show. How does someone go about being the best board member they can be?
I think the first thing that I'll mention is what Joe said. I think you have to take it as a serious job. You are taking on a lot of responsibility. There is effectiveness of you as an individual board member that you have to look at, and then there's the effectiveness collectively as a group. The effectiveness is measured by, how successful the organization that you are helping govern is going in terms of its growth, in terms of its resilience. And, there are ways of measuring boards' performance with performance reviews. So you want to institute that. You want to have 360 conversations. And, you constantly want to be asking yourself this question: am I an effective board member on this board? And if you're not, then you should really think about bringing somebody who can be effective. That's obviously harder done than said. But I think my top thinking of board effectiveness as an individual is to go in thinking that it is something serious and important that you are there to do, and you have to be adding value.
Let me pick up on that. Absolutely. Preparation for the work, like any other job, is going to make you better at it. Asking the additional questions or asking for additional information from management is going to help make you better prepared. But in the boardroom, it is like a team. It's important to be a very good listener. A lot of board members think that the most important thing is to be able to say some really important stuff every now and then, and that helps. But really listening to what management is saying, listening to what the CEO or CFO is saying, listening to what the other board members are saying, so that you really understand the situation that you're addressing, that is very important to be effective. It is also true that self-governance of boards is critically important to maintain a successful board. I think for a long time, people joined boards and were reluctant to get off, and management wasn't really quick to change boards. But I think what we've learned increasingly is that as companies change, as the circumstances of their business changes, the board needs to change. The board that may have made you successful today is unlikely, in many instances, to be the board that's going to make you successful tomorrow. So boards need to look at themselves critically at all times. And as in any other job, getting training as you go is a very good idea, whether it's the NACD or the PDA or a number of other organizations. Getting some background, or the DCRO, as we said before, that may make you more valuable is always a good idea. You should never really be complacent about what skills you brought or what you think you're bringing by way of other attributes to a board, because you can always, make yourself a better player. So I would say back to taking it seriously as a job. How can you be the best board member you can be? One of them is preparing. One of them is making yourself better. But as I said, it's also about listening and working with management. In most cases, the job of a board member in a private company situation is working with and supporting management. It's not always the case, but it usually is the case. And that is something that I think is really important to keep in mind. How can we help this team drive the strategic plan? How can we make them successful? How can we help them create the kind of succession plan that they need? Those are the things that boards need to be able to do, but it's a working relationship. And the better that relationship is, usually the more effective a board can be, and ultimately the more effective a company is likely to be.
One resource to recommend for board effectiveness is a book called High Performance Boards by one of our guests, Didier Costin, who runs the Global Board Center at IMD. This book has a wonderful set of tools, templates, and other ideas on board effectiveness and measuring it.
Well, Joe and Raza, you guys have just unloaded
We had a recent guest of ours was a person named Marcus Peacock. He is the COO of the Business Roundtable. And I think, as you know, Alexander, the Business Roundtable in the last few years, especially with the advent of their statement of corporate purpose a few years ago, has really become far more active in taking a position on governance and what it should be. And their whole idea of the purpose of a board serving all stakeholders is something that has been growing here in this country and even more so in Europe. But their statement really brought it to a lot of people's attention. And it was interesting speaking with him because his board, the board that he helps manage as COO, is a board of 20-plus CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the United States. And one of the things I learned from him is how seriously those CEOs take their job as board members. So, they are kind of acting on what they would want in their own boardroom. And I think it's a great lesson because they could not take it so seriously, but it turns out they take it extremely seriously. And that's really part of the mindset I think you need to be an effective board member.
Well, Joe and Raza, I feel like you guys have dropped so much knowledge today from the guests that you've had, some of the fantastic episodes from the Onboards podcast, as well as your own background and experience. And we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Raza and Joe. We don't often have two guests on, but that was a lot of fun to hear their background and experience, how they really covered the board perspective, especially the private company of Board Worlds, and what it looks like from their own experience, but also many of the guests they've had for their Onboards podcasts. And I'm going to suggest if you enjoy listening to our podcast, you'll enjoy theirs as well. They've got some fabulous episodes. You're going to hear things about what make a board successful, what it takes to be an effective board member, what challenges boards are facing. And if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find a link to their podcast and any of the resources that we talked about today. Now, please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.